The icy wind cut through the dense forest like a blade, howling between the trees as snowflakes swirled violently in the air. John Parker pulled his coat tighter around his body, his breath forming thick clouds in the bitter cold. The winter storm had arrived faster than expected, turning what was supposed to be a peaceful afternoon hike into a treacherous battle against nature. As he trudged forward, the deep snow crunching beneath his boots, a faint sound caught his attention, a whimper, barely audible over the roaring wind. John stopped in his tracks, straining to listen. There was again a desperate cry for help. His heart pounded. Someone or something was out there suffering in the cold. Without hesitation, he veered off the trail, pushing through knee-deep snow, his eyes scanning the white wilderness. Then he saw it, a small, trembling figure partially buried beneath a snowdrift. A dog, a black and white border collie, its fur coated in ice, eyes wide with fear and exhaustion. John's pulse quickened as he rushed to the animal's side. The poor thing was barely moving, its body stiff from the freezing temperatures. He could see its breath, weak and slow, struggling to stay alive. He knew he had to act fast. "I've got you, buddy," John murmured, carefully brushing the snow away. He could feel the dog's ribs through its thick fur. It was starving, cold, and on the brink of collapse. Gently, he scooped the trembling animal into his arms, shielding it from the brutal wind. The dog let out a faint whine, but didn't resist. It was too weak to fight. John wasted no time. He turned and trudged back toward his cabin, his boots slipping against the icy ground. Every step felt like a battle against the elements, the storm growing fiercer by the minute. He could feel the dog's shallow breathing against his chest, its life hanging by a thread. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached the small wooden cabin nestled between the trees. Kicking the door open, he rushed inside, shutting out the brutal storm behind him. The warmth of the fireplace instantly enveloped them, the contrast almost shocking. John set the dog down on a thick blanket by the fire and quickly grabbed a towel, rubbing its frozen fur to restore circulation. The collie whimpered softly, its eyes fluttering open. "It's okay," John whispered. "You're safe now." He reached for a bowl and filled it with warm water, placing it gently in front of the dog. The animal weakly lifted its head, sniffing at the liquid before lapping at it hesitantly. John watched, relieved to see the dog responding, even if just barely. As the minutes passed, the collie's shivering began to subside, warmth returning to its fragile body. John let out a deep breath, running a hand through his own frostbitten hair. He had done it. He had saved this poor creature from certain death. But just as he was beginning to relax, something unexpected happened. The dog's ears perked up suddenly, its body tensing. It let out a low, guttural growl, a sound not of fear, but of warning. John's stomach twisted, and then, from outside in the darkness of the storm, he heard it, a sound that sent a chill down his spine, a sound that told him he wasn't alone. John froze. The growl from the border collie was unmistakable, low, rumbling, and filled with an intensity that sent goosebumps up his arms. The dog, barely clinging to life just moments ago, was now standing on shaky legs, its ears pinned back, staring at the door. Then there was again a sound from outside, a muffled crunch. Someone was moving through the snow. John's cabin was miles from the nearest town. No one should be out here, especially not in the middle of a raging blizzard. He slowly rose to his feet, his pulse hammering against his ribs. He grabbed the fire poker from the hearth, gripping it tightly. The dog's body stiffened, its tail rigid, eyes locked on the door. And then another sound, this time closer. Tap, tap, tap. Someone was at the window. John's breath hitched. His cabin had only one window, a small pane of glass near the door. He turned his head slowly, dreading what he might see. And then he did see it, a face, pale skin pressed against the glass. Eyes, dark, unblinking, staring straight into the cabin. John's grip tightened around the poker, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. The dog let out a sharp bark, the sudden noise shattering the eerie silence. But the face at the window didn't flinch. It just stood there, watching, Then it disappeared. A second later, the door handle rattled. John took a step back, every muscle in his body screaming for him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The storm outside was merciless. He wouldn't last 5 minutes. The dog lunged forward, barking furiously now, its frail body seeming to regain strength with each second. It wasn't just warning John, it was protecting him. And then, bang! The door shook violently as something slammed against it from the outside. John's instincts kicked in. He grabbed the heavy wooden table and shoved it against the door, barricading it just as another thunderous bang echoed through the cabin. The dog was now in full defense mode, standing in front of John, growling with an intensity that didn't match its weakened state. It was ready to fight. John's mind raced. Who was outside? And why? Then came the whisper, from just beyond the door. "Let me in." John's skin crawled. The voice was soft, almost childlike, but something about it was wrong. It wasn't pleading. It wasn't afraid. It was mocking. The dog barked again, more aggressively this time, stepping forward. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the banging stopped. Silence. John didn't move. His breath came in shallow gasps. The fire crackled softly behind him, the only sound in the cabin. Then the dog did something strange. It turned its head toward John, looked him dead in the eyes, and wagged its tail. John blinked in confusion. "What?" he whispered. The collie trotted to the door and sat. The growling ceased. It was waiting. John hesitated. Then footsteps, not toward the door, away from it. John exhaled, only now realizing he'd been holding his breath. He waited, heart hammering, but the sound of crunching snow faded until there was nothing but the wind once more. Whoever or whatever had been out there was gone. John didn't sleep that night. The border collie curled up beside him, its warmth oddly reassuring. He kept the fire going, his ears trained for any noise beyond the howling storm. But nothing returned. By morning, the blizzard had passed. Cautiously, John unblocked the door and stepped outside. The sky was clear, sunlight glinting off the thick layers of snow. But something was off. No footprints. No sign that anyone had been there at all. John swallowed hard, his mind racing. Had it been the storm? Had the wind erased the tracks? Or had there ever been tracks to begin with? He turned back toward the cabin. The border collie sat at the threshold, watching him. John knelt down. "You knew, didn't you?" he murmured. The dog wagged its tail again, then stepped forward and nuzzled his hand. John sighed, rubbing the dog's head. "Guess we're stuck together now?" The collie let out a soft bark. And just like that, John knew. Whatever had been outside the night before, he didn't face it alone. And maybe, just maybe, this dog hadn't been out there by accident. Maybe it had come to save him. John couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Even as the morning sun stretched over the snow-covered trees, casting long, golden beams through the branches, the weight of the previous night still clung to him. The storm had passed, and yet an eerie silence lingered in its wake. But it was more than that. It was the footprints, or rather, the lack of them. There should have been tracks. John had heard the crunching of snow, had seen the face at the window, had felt the presence on the other side of the door. And yet, now that the storm had cleared, there was no sign that anyone had ever been there. He stood just beyond the cabin, scanning the tree line. The woods were dense, the kind of wilderness that stretched for miles with no signs of civilization. Even if someone had wandered this deep into the forest, they wouldn't have survived the night. Not in that storm. And yet, John exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face. Maybe exhaustion was getting to him. Maybe the fear from last night had twisted his mind into seeing things that weren't there. But then there was the dog. The border collie sat near the threshold of the cabin, watching him intently. Its black and white fur was still matted from the cold, but its eyes were sharp, focused. Almost too focused. John knelt beside it. "You saw it too, didn't you?" The collie didn't move. He reached out, scratching behind its ears. "What's your story, huh? Where'd you come from?" No collar. No tags. No sign it had belonged to anyone. And then, as if responding to his question, the dog suddenly stood and trotted toward the edge of the trees. John's brow furrowed. "Where are you going?" The dog paused, turning back as if waiting for him. A strange feeling crept up John's spine. He hesitated, glancing back at the cabin. The logical thing to do was stay put, forget last night, and get back to town once the roads were clear. But something about the way the dog was looking at him, leading him, made his gut tighten with a different kind of instinct. He followed. The collie moved with purpose, weaving through the trees as if it knew exactly where it was going. John trudged behind it, the snow crunching beneath his boots. The deeper they went, the more unsettling the forest became. The air was still, too still. Then the dog stopped. John nearly bumped into it, pulling up short. "What is it?" The collie was staring ahead, ears perked, tail stiff. John followed its gaze and felt his stomach drop. There, partially buried in the snow, was a structure. A small, weathered cabin. His first instinct was to think it was abandoned, just another forgotten hunting lodge deep in the forest. But something about it felt wrong. The windows were covered in frost, dark and lifeless. The wood was aged and cracked, the roof sagging beneath the weight of the snow. And yet, despite its decay, the door stood firm, intact, almost untouched. John swallowed hard. "What the hell is this?" The collie let out a soft growl. John stepped forward. Something about this place sent ice through his veins, but he couldn't ignore the nagging pull in his gut. He climbed the steps, boots creaking against the old wood. Then, as he reached the door, he saw it. The scratches. Long, deep claw marks running down the wood, as if something had tried to force its way inside. John's heart pounded. He turned the handle. The door creaked open. The stench at him first. The sharp, metallic tang of blood mixed with the stale, rotten air of decay. John stepped inside, covering his nose. His eyes adjusted to the dim interior, and what he saw made his skin crawl. The cabin was in ruins. Broken furniture littered the floor. Old newspapers yellowed with age covered the table. But the worst part, the part that made his stomach twist, was the bed in the corner. A body lay on it, or rather, what remained of one. John stumbled backward, his breath coming in short gasps. The corpse was skeletal, dressed in tattered clothing. Its face was nothing but a hollow skull, mouth frozen in a silent scream. John felt bile rise in his throat. What the hell had happened here? The collie stood at the doorway, its body tense. It wasn't afraid. It was watching, waiting. Then John saw something else, something even more disturbing. Scattered on the floor were photographs. Old, black and white pictures, their edges curled from age. John stepped closer, carefully picking one up. His blood ran cold. It was his cabin. The same wooden walls, the same fireplace. Except in the photo, the furniture was different. Older. John flipped through the others, his fingers trembling. There were more pictures. Images of the forest. The snow-covered trees. The very path he had just walked down. Then, one final photo. John's breath caught in his throat. It was him, standing at the window. The same window from last night. The picture was old, faded, but there was no denying it. The face in the photo, the person staring through the glass, was him. John dropped the pictures, his pulse racing. This wasn't possible. This wasn't. A soft whine snapped him back to reality. The dog. The collie was watching him, eyes full of something John couldn't quite place. And then suddenly, John understood. This dog. This place. The storm. The face at the window. It wasn't a warning. It was a trap. Something had lured him here. Something had been waiting. His chest tightened. He had to get out. Now. John turned, but the door slammed shut. The last thing he heard before the darkness swallowed him was the dog's bark, and then silence. Darkness swallowed John whole. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he was still breathing. The suffocating blackness pressed against him, thick and alive, as if the walls themselves had closed in. His heart hammered in his chest, adrenaline surging through his veins. Then movement, a shuffling sound, a whisper of something brushing against the walls. John forced himself to stay still, to listen. His own ragged breaths echoed in his ears, but beneath them, there was something else. A slow, deliberate clicking noise, like nails or claws. Panic surged through him, but before he could react, a sudden, sharp growl cut through the silence. The dog, the border collie, was still with him, its glowing eyes reflected in the darkness, fixed on something just beyond John's vision. And then, a screech. The sound was unnatural, high-pitched, a wail of something inhuman. Then came the first strike. Something slammed against the walls, shaking the entire cabin. John stumbled backward, his hands blindly feeling for anything, a weapon, an escape, anything. Another boom. And then, as if reality itself fractured, the cabin shifted. The walls warped. The air rippled. The space around him no longer felt real. John squeezed his eyes shut, his pulse racing. "This isn't happening," he muttered. "This isn't real." But then, a breath, right beside his ear. A whisper. "It's time to remember." John's eyes flew open, his body stiff with terror. But the cabin was no longer the same. The rotting wood was gone. The dust, the decay, it had all vanished. Instead, he was standing in a cabin that was whole. The fire crackled warmly in the hearth, casting flickering golden light on the walls. Outside, the snowstorm had faded into a quiet, peaceful dusk. But most horrifying of all, the corpse on the bed was gone. In its place was a man, alive, breathing, and he looked exactly like John. John's throat went dry. His knees nearly buckled. The other John, the past John, sat on the bed, staring blankly ahead. His face was younger, untouched by the weight of fear and time. He seemed unaware of his future self standing just a few feet away. Then he moved. He reached down, picking up something from the floor. A knife. John's stomach twisted as the memories flooded back, rushing in like a wave that had been held back for far too long. He knew this place. He knew what was about to happen, because it had happened before. This wasn't the first time. It was a loop, a trap, and the dog had brought him back to stop it. John staggered forward, his voice hoarse. "No, wait." But past John didn't hear him. He turned the blade in his hands, his movements slow, deliberate. And then the door burst open. A shadowy figure stepped inside. It was him, or rather, it was the thing that had been wearing his face. John couldn't move. He couldn't even breathe. The creature was tall, its skin stretched tight over a twisted, unnatural frame. Its eyes were black pits, soulless and endless. It had been watching him all along. John felt his blood turn to ice as it spoke, its voice layered, as if 1,000 whispers spoke at once. "You cannot change this." The past John turned toward it, his face blank. He didn't fight. He didn't resist. He simply let it happen. John screamed. He lunged forward, but the moment he did, the room shattered like glass. And suddenly, he was back in the ruined cabin. The body was there once more, skeletal and lifeless. The cold seeped back into his bones, and the border collie was staring at him. John fell to his knees, his head spinning. He understood now. This had happened before. Again, and again, and again. Somewhere in time, he had been trapped here, forced to relive the nightmare, forced to forget. And the only thing that had ever fought back was the dog. Tears burned in John's eyes as he looked at the collie, realization crashing over him like a tidal wave. You brought me back," he whispered. The dog wagged its tail once. A quiet confirmation. John clenched his fists. "Then this time I stop it." The cabin trembled. The air turned heavy. It knew. The thing that had been watching, waiting, it knew John was fighting back. And it was angry. The walls split open. Darkness poured through, tendrils of shadow snaking toward him. The whispers grew louder, deafening. "You belong to us?" John gritted his teeth. "Not this time." He grabbed the dog, wrapping his arms around it, and did the only thing that made sense. He ran, straight into the darkness, straight into the unknown. And then, the world exploded into light. John woke up gasping for air. He was outside. The morning sun bathed the snowy forest in golden light, the air crisp and fresh. The nightmare was over. And beside him, the border collie lay curled up, breathing softly. John let out a shuddering breath. He had broken the loop. For the first time, he was free. He reached out, stroking the dog's fur. "You saved me," he whispered. The collie lifted its head, staring at him with knowing eyes. Then, for the first time since John had found him, the dog barked, a sharp, triumphant sound. John laughed, tears spilling down his face. Whatever had haunted that cabin, whatever had been keeping him there, was gone, and he had this dog to thank. John pushed himself to his feet, stretching his sore limbs. He looked down at the collie and smiled. "Come on, buddy. Let's go home." And together, they walked away, never looking back, never needing to, because the past was finally behind them. And this time it would stay that way. John didn't know how long he had been walking. The snow crunched softly beneath his boots, the morning sun casting a golden glow over the forest. The air was crisp, but for the first time in what felt like forever, it wasn't suffocating. It wasn't heavy. He was free. The border collie trotted beside him, its black and white, fur gleaming under the sunlight. Every so often, the dog would glance up at him, as if to make sure he was still there. John smiled. "I should give you a name, huh?" The collie wagged its tail. John thought for a moment. "How about Shadow?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "No, too ominous." "Lucky." He tilted his head. "You did save me, after all." The dog barked once, as if in approval. John sighed, running a hand through his hair. He still wasn't sure what had really happened back at that cabin. The memories were hazy, like fragments of a nightmare that refused to fade. But one thing was clear. The dog had saved him. Again and again. And maybe John wasn't the first. His mind drifted back to the corpse in the cabin. The man who had looked just like him. Had he been another victim? Another soul trapped in that endless cycle? Had the collie tried to save him, too? John clenched his fists. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for certain. He was alive because of this dog, and he wasn't going to waste that chance. Hours later, they reached the edge of town. John hadn't realized just how far he had wandered into the wilderness. The sight of buildings, roads, and distant rooftops felt almost surreal after everything he had been through. He took a deep breath, savoring the reality of it. People, life. He had escaped something truly evil, something beyond human understanding. But the real world still existed, and he still had a place in it. John glanced down at the collie. "Guess we should find you a home? Huh?" The dog just wagged its tail. John exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He hadn't had a pet in years. His life had been too chaotic, too unstable. But now, he looked at the dog again, really looked at it. Could he really let it go? It had saved his life. It had been the only thing keeping him tethered to reality when the darkness tried to take him. And it had chosen him. John chuckled to himself. "Guess that settles it." He knelt down, scratching behind the dog's ears. "You're coming home with me." The collie barked in approval, pressing its head against his hand. John smiled, a warmth spreading in his chest. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't alone. Maybe that was the real message in all of this. Sometimes we're lost in battles we don't even understand, fighting demons we can't see, trapped in cycles we don't realize we're repeating. And sometimes, all it takes is one soul, one companion to pull us out, to remind us that we're not alone, to give us a reason to keep going. John stood up, taking one last look at the snowy woods behind him. Then he turned away, toward his new life, toward home. And with his loyal companion by his side, he knew he would never be lost again. This story isn't just about survival. It's about connection. It's about the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. How sometimes, when everything feels lost, a loyal companion can be the only thing holding us together. The border collie wasn't just a dog. It was a protector, a guardian, a friend, and maybe, in a world full of unseen battles and hidden darkness, that's what we all need. Someone who refuses to let us fade. Someone who fights for us, even when we don't know we need saving. Maybe that's what animals have been doing for us all along. And maybe it's time we start doing the same for them.